Welcome to the latest edition of Election Science Office Hours, a webinar and podcast hosted by the Lynn Center for Science, Society, and Policy here at Caltech and moderated by me, Michael Alvarez. You'll find that our archive now has 24 episodes available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, and they're listed on our Caltech Election Integrity Project page on our website at protectingtheelection.us. Make sure that you follow the Lynn Center on social media for the latest updates on this part of our project, Elections and Democracy, as well as all the other projects that the Lynn Center is undertaking at Caltech. We're also on LinkedIn, X, and Blue Sky, so make sure to follow us there. This is looking forward to this one today. This is going to be a lot of fun because my guest today is my longtime colleague here at Caltech and friend, Jonathan Katz, the K. Sugahara Professor of Social Sciences and Statistics here at Caltech. His research is really complementary to mine. His work lies at the intersections of political science, economic, and statistics. He focuses primarily on the development of statistical methods for social sciences and empirical applications, especially to elections and other important policy questions. In addition to all the academic work that Jonathan's been doing for the last few decades, I'll say decades, because we've both been here for 3 decades, right?
Yes.
Jonathan's been involved in a number of really interesting startup companies, and he has a long-standing statistical consulting practice that's been focused primarily on providing expertise in election law cases. And we'll talk a little bit about some of that today, probably. He's been involved in more than 50 cases in both state and federal court in the last 2 decades, including several that were ultimately decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. So, Jonathan, welcome.
Mike, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being with us here today on Election Science Office Hours. We got a lot to talk about. You're an expert on redistricting, and the redistricting process here in the U.S. is in the news. You've published a lot in this area, and of course, you've worked on countless redistricting cases. What originally drew you to this area of social science?
Yeah, it was not my intent. I didn't start out in grad school saying, oh, I want to become an expert in redistricting, among other things. I think it was very much like the usual scientific process. I was working on a project with Gary Cox, one of my advisors at UC San Diego when I was in my PhD program. And we were interested in a different question. We were interested in understanding understanding U.S. House of Representatives elections and some fundamental changes that went on, appeared to sort of change in the mid-1960s. And particular things about why incumbents seem to do better than non-incumbents. And we had a series of papers on that, but ultimately we were interested in the question is why? What changed in the mid-1960s? And the sort of obvious answer was what we now refer to as the reapportionment revolution, which for those of you not in the know, refers to the 2 particular Supreme Court cases. Baker v. Carr is probably the most famous one, the so-called one person, one vote, which basically outlawed malapportionment, and then its application to the U.S. congressional elections in Westbury v. Sanders, which happened 2 years later. And that really ushered in this period of massive redistricting. And prior to that cases, there just wasn't a whole lot of redistricting. I know that's hard to imagine since redistricting seems to be in the news regularly, but it only really dates to Mike and R's childhood, which is truly scary. That's how old we are. And that's how we got into it.
So that work, some of it ultimately ended up in this really great book that you wrote with Gary Cox, Elbridge Gerry's Salamander, The Electoral Consequences of the Reapportionment Revolution, which is a great title. So can you just tell us like kind of a summary of the argument in the book, in particular, who Elbridge Gerry is, what that means, and how did the reapportionment revolution change incumbency, the value of incumbency in American elections?
Right. So Elbridge Gerry was Gary actually is I think it's appropriately pronounced. It was governor of Massachusetts in the 1800s, late 1800s, and he's sort of credited with his actions are credited with creating the name gerrymandering. It's a play on his name because he had asked the legislature to draw a district for his brother who wanted to run for state legislative office, and I forget the local paper. I don't think it was the Globe, that Boston Globe, but it was whatever the major local paper was. Had looked at the sort of map and said, this looks like a salamander, and hence the word gerrymander came into being in colloquial usage, and we still use it, all these centuries, a couple of centuries later, century and a half later. And the book was really so. Cox and I were not the first to sort of think, oh, maybe this redistricting stuff in the mid 1960s was important and sort of changed American politics. But surprisingly, this is one of these cases where the academics said, we looked at that and it didn't really do anything. Gary and I sort of wanted to look at this from a different perspective, because it's kind of hard to imagine that this didn't change things, given like the amount of resources that goes into it, right? And here we are at Caltech. We generally believe that if people put a lot of effort and spend a lot of money on it, this should have some impact. And in essence, our argument was what the previous scholars who looked at redistricting, they sort of said, redistricting doesn't matter. It sort of cancels out. When we sort of looked at it in the aggregate, it doesn't seem to matter that much. And what Cox and I basically show is that, well, no, what they missed was sort of this important heterogeneity at the state level about how do states choose particular plans. That is, do they gerrymander, or how do they gerrymander? And that when you sort of mushed it all together, you got nothing. But if you actually looked at it in its constituent state parts, there were, and you group them by, did the Dems have unified control, or Republicans have unified control, or were the courts involved, that you actually saw quite sizable effects of redistricting on the change in American elections, starting in around the mid 1960s. So that's how we got into it. That's what the book's about.
Okay, so what I'm curious about now is that it seems like, as we've just been sort of laughing about this, that we're entering this kind of new period with respect to redistricting. And why don't we call it gerrymandering? I don't know. I don't get that part, but gerrymandering, right?
Yeah.
What lessons are you drawing from the history? I mean, are we at a point in time where this process is again going to be really influential and really alter fundamental aspects of elections or American democracy?
American democracy, I wish I could say something about that. That's a harder question to answer. We definitely, it has been the case that the gerrymandering has had profound effects at the state level. The question whether or not it has big effects on average in the U.S. House, I think the consensus from my work and others is that it does sort of balance out, right? Currently the U.S. House is not particularly drawn in such a way that particularly favors Democrats or Republicans, although this mid-decade redrawing might be an attempt to try to undo that, which I guess we'll spend some more time talking about. But so gerrymandering has always had an important effect, again, at the local level, at the sort of how particular delegations look, or how state legislative maps look. Mm-hmm. Like I said, the question is, what's the aggregate effect? I would say, just on a historical perspective, we're just sort of back to the late 1890s, which is the sort of mid-decade redistricting, is a sort of highly polarized period of politics. We actually just look more like we did in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and sort of maybe the period of post-war America, so the 1960s to the early 2000s, was sort of the anomalous period. We're sort of back to sort of highly polarized elections. So I'm not quite so sure that this is ahistorical. It's just we're reverting to mean. Okay,
so we're reverting back to the mean. Now digging a little deeper into kind of what's going on today, we're in the final stages of the Prop 50 campaign here in California. It's kind of hard for me to believe that the election's just next Tuesday. But Texas started this battle over partisan gerrymandering by undertaking this mid-cycle gerrymander, which I guess I didn't realize was even something the states did, but they definitely do it. Can you start us off by defining what a partisan gerrymander is and how it differs from other forms of gerrymandering?
Right. So partisan gerrymander is literally means drawing a map to favor one party. And what is when I talk about this, and this work I've done with Gary King and a former student of ours, Lizzie Rosenblatt, partisan fairness is really measured as sort of is the map asymmetric. So if the Dems get 55% of the votes and they get 65% of the seats, we'll call that fair, as long as when the Republicans in the counterfactual world where the Republicans get 55% of the vote, they also get 65% of the seat. And deviations from this symmetry is what we refer to as partisan bias. The other types of gerrymanders that people talk about most commonly are sort of incumbent protecting gerrymanders, which might have political consequences, right? It might cement in Dems, Democrats, or Republicans, but really the point was to make them safe, right? Which is another sort of a different type of threat to democracy, right? If competitive elections are a necessary condition of democracy, right? So making elections not competitive seems like a bad thing to do as well. And then the third type, which is actually something the Supreme Court's taken up now, is under the Voting Rights Act, we've intentionally drawn some districts to favor protected minority groups, typically by creating majority minority districts. When the courts have found that the protected group, say African American, Blacks, or Latinos, for example, are denied their ability to elect candidates of choice, then a solution has been put forward to create majority minority districts where they have the chance to elect their candidate of choice.
So a lot of times when I talk to students like in class or talk to folks out in the public or like my family, when I try to explain this stuff to them, partisan gerrymandering just seems a little bit unfair, especially if it leads to extreme forms of partisan bias. Why do the courts allow partisan gerrymandering?
That's a good question. So it definitely is unfair, right? It is sort of, the statement I always like about gerrymandering is letting politicians choose their voters as opposed to voters choosing their politicians, right? So you're trying to rig the deck in some way. The courts, so early on, before so we often think of Baker v. Carr as being important because it got rid of malapportionment, which was huge. I mean, states like Illinois, the ratio of largest to smallest district in the 1960s was literally 11-1. These were not small differences. But the courts had basically, prior to Baker v. Carr, basically said, you know what, that's the political thicket. We don't get involved in that. Constitution says Congress is the judge of its own elections. We don't go there. And so the really fundamental thing was in this case was to say, you know what, no, these are judicial issues, that these do affect the rights of voters, right, to be equally represented by their elected officials. So that's sort of what's changed, and that's expanded. The courts have become much more involved in not just gerrymandering, right? Voting rights cases. You and I have both been involved in election technology. There's been fights over election technology, ballot order. So these are all questions which the courts would never have entertained, but do now.
Well, what restrictions in general do the courts today place on partisan gerrymandering?
Very little. So the Supreme Court sort of for a decade sort of had it as an open question about whether or not partisan gerrymandering was justiciable. And eventually they decided a few years ago that basically partisan gerrymandering is not judicial. That is a bridge too far. That is too political for them to get involved in. So the only breaks on political gerrymandering happens in state law or state constitutions. Like, so in California, something we'll talk about, California's solution to this was to try and have an independent redistricting commission. The state of Oregon passed a constitutional amendment which bars drawing maps to favor incumbents or favoring parties, and sets up some standards, and the state Supreme Court acts as a sort of administrative agency to make sure that the maps enacted don't favor parties. So all the breaks on partisan gerrymandering have happened, if at all, at the state level.
So is it fair to say then that generally speaking, as long as whatever is being done is consistent with the state's constitution and the state's laws, that the federal courts are generally going to allow that as far as partisan gerrymandering goes?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I'm not a lawyer, but I spent enough time with election lawyers that that's basically the consensus among the ones I know.
Great. Okay. So now we've kind of set the stage and we have a good sense for what partisan gerrymandering is. And I know you've worked in Texas before and on Texas redistricting before. Can you just kind of walk us through kind of what went down in Texas and why this has sparked this controversy nationally?
Yeah, Texas is always Texas, like California, where the state we're in, is a big prize, right? There's lots of seats, and Texas in particular has been a growing state, right? So they've been adding seats over the last several federal censuses. And it's one in which the Republicans, who have a majority, have a trifecta, that is, they control the governorship and both chambers of the state legislature, have been very aggressive in general about choosing rules which they think are advantageous to them winning elections. So Texas has repeatedly been in court about partisan gerrymandering, about voting rights, whether or not there are maps, for example, disenfranchise. They refer to Latinos as Hispanic voters in the state. Lots and lots of litigation. It's probably the most litigated place that I know of. And their map, which they passed after the 2020 census, was a pretty, not extreme, but was a pretty pro-Republican map. The estimates I saw range, the Republicans are picking up about an extra 5% of the seats. So for 50% of the vote, they get about 55% of the seats, whereas the Dems only get 50% of the seats. So, you only get 45% of the seats. So it was already skewed their way. But coming into, I think Republicans looking to the midterm election in 2026, given concerns about Trump's popularity, perhaps some early warning signs in the economy, are concerned that they're going to have a tough time. And recall, they only have a razor-thin majority. They effectively have there's 219. The Republicans have 219 seats currently, to 213 seats for the Dems, and there's 3 open seats. Although one of them's been filled, but the new congresswoman from Arizona, Democrat, has not been sworn in, which was itself a political question. And so I think with these razor-thin majorities and looking at the tailwinds might be against them in the 2026, the Trump administration and other senior Republicans have been looking for ways which they might try to boost their performance and maintain at least their control of the House after the 2026 election, and that's what prompted it.
So my understanding of this, though, is that Texas has done these kinds of mid-cycle redistrictings before. Is that correct?
They have, but it's more complicated. I think most of the mid-decade, so Texas has redrawn mid-decade, mostly in response to litigation.
Okay.
So not with the express aims of improving their performance with regard to towards, in this case, the Republicans. So they have redrawn, but not purely for political gain mid-decade.
So and again, I just think that may be one of the reasons why people have been, talking about it and why this has become such an issue, because I guess in the past, Texas has been sort of forced to redraw their lines between census periods. Here, they're doing it deliberately with this very express political rationale.
Right. They're taking a map that was like, if you saw, it was about 5 percentage points in favor of them. The estimates, these are estimates, so there's some uncertainty with them, but would at least double the bias in favor of them, which is that's a huge bias in favor of the Republicans.
Right. And so then what we're seeing here in California now, and there's just this interesting evolution of the story with Prop 50, is that Prop 50 in some sense is a response to what Texas has been doing. And I'm sure that, you live in pretty much the same neighborhood I do. You're probably getting those campaign mailers. Maybe you've seen some of the TV ads. And
how can you forget the text messages?
The text messages. I got a no on 51 this morning, which is the first one that I've seen in my.
I got that one. I got 2 no's today and 1 yes on 50 in my texts.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's really starting to heat up. So can you give us kind of a brief overview of Prop 50 and what the kind of yes and no sides are really trying to argue here?
Sure. So I already noted that before the last redistricting, before the last federal census, California had passed by a citizen referendum a constitutional amendment which created an independent redistricting commission with the goal to try to minimize the sort of partisan interference in the drawing of districts. What Prop 50 does is a 2-part thing. So what it does is it suspends that constitutional amendment which created the independent redistricting commission until until after the 2030 federal census. So, and then what it does is the legislature drew a map, and it says, so if you pass this, not only does it suspend this independent redistricting commission clause in the California Constitution, but it will say this map will be in place through the 2030 election. And the map was intentionally drawn to remove about 5 Republican seats. So to redraw the map so that you would move Republicans out of those districts and move in some Democrats.
So yes on 50 then says yes to that process and yes to that particular map that's being proposed. No says no. It's a pretty straightforward ballot measure as ballot measures go in California.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. It's the yes and no camps are very clear. It's not like some of the ballot measures that I've definitely had to vote on over the years, where you're not really sure what the ballot measure is actually doing or what it will do in practice. Yes, this is clearly. So the way to think about it is yes on Prop 50 basically moves 5 districts from the pro-Republican column to the likely pro-Democratic column.
Again, it's pretty straightforward. Now, we mentioned a few minutes ago that you've gotten 3 text messages today. I've gotten at least 1 that I know about. Lots of advertising is going on. What do you think about the yes and no campaigns so far? Is there anything that sort of stands out for you in terms of like one campaign maybe kind of messaging better or than the other?
Well, I mean, I think the polling is suggesting that the yes on 50 is doing better, right? So I was actually rather surprised. The initial polling was actually pretty positive on Prop 50. Somewhere around 50% were in favor, about 40% no, with about 10 to 12% unknown. My numbers are a little off, but got that. And the latest poll I saw, which was from a couple of days ago, has seen the positive side move to 57%. So that would suggest that the yes on 50 campaign, which is being led by our Governor Newsom and his political supporters, seem to be doing well. They are also way outspending the no on Prop 50.
Yeah, I think the thing that I've been trying to track most closely about the polling is that the gap seems to be narrowing between those who say they'll vote yes and no. But there still seems to be quite a few people who, to the pollsters, are saying that they're undecided. And it is a very pretty clear choice, right?
Yeah, I mean, but here's why I think, I mean, even I'm conflicted, right? So you might think, right? So there's sort of 2 equally important sort of, I hate to say moral, but the sort of political questions. One is gerrymandering bad? Partisan gerrymandering bad? The answer is, I think, unequivocally, yes, that's bad for democracy. But that's fine. But the question is, should the Democrats sort of unilaterally disarm, right? Which is, so the Republicans clearly are willing to use this, right? So the map that Texas has passed is going to probably move about 5. Well, it's actually open question about how many it's going to move, but about, suppose you thought it was going to move 5 in their direction. I think that's a little optimistic, and we can talk a little more about that, right? So the question is we can. So I think people and Democrats have been much more willing to say that democracy and things like electoral reforms that should make the system fair are preferred. You know, things that make access to ballots easier, access to registration easier, right? But the question is should the Dems unilaterally give up when many Dems are very unhappy with the current Republican control of the federal government? So I think that's the conflict you're seeing. They don't like, morally, they don't like the approving something, but they don't also want to sort of let the Republicans get away with sort of unfettered control, you know, being played by their own rules.
Right, and again, that's what makes this fascinating to me. I mean, I just think that we've never seen something like this, or haven't seen anything in my memory in California. In some ways, the ballot measure itself is so clear, except for so many voters, it represents such a complicated problem, right?
Right. I think it's a particularly complicated problem for Democrats who've generally been both in California, I think in the U.S., much more willing to adopt electoral changes, which they view as morally good for access and for fairness.
So I'm going to put you on the spot for a second. Like if I gave you $100 right now and said you could put it in the betting market, yes or no, how would you allocate it between yes and no?
Oh, I put almost all on yes. Although the polling's narrowing a little bit, the no on Prop 50 seems that their campaign seems to be sputtering. It's been funded primarily by Charlie Munger Jr., who's and he's basically stopped spending. He hasn't spent any real money on the campaign in a couple of weeks, and none is scheduled to be spent. In fact, Newsom is in fact calling up his financial support and saying, "Stop! We spent enough. Better use your money elsewhere." So I think I'm a big believer that the money knows what's going on, and if you see this, if you see the backer the no campaign sort of basically packing up shop, that's not particularly a good sign for the measure.
I've been surprised by the lack of funding on the no side. I had really expected, obviously, Charlie Munger put money into this because he was one of the original proponents of this reform decades ago. But I was really surprised that, say, the National Republicans didn't step up and use this as an opportunity to, push back against Newsom. Because, ultimately, if this fails, it could be a bit of a black eye for Newsom and his political prospects in the future, right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think partly though that they're concerned, right? So it only works as a black eye against Newsom if you think the no side's going to win, right? And I think the Republicans looked at California's current politics and Newsom's popularity, and Trump is unpopular overall, but he's really unpopular in California, and said this is a hill that's just too hard to climb. And I think Munger thought that if he's put a few million, several $1 million into it, that would get others to give. And I think they all made the same answer that the National Republicans did, which is this in California, given the current situation, this is just not a winnable battle.
We have a pretty good question in the Q&A. Let me just pose it because it takes us a step back to Prop 50, something I should have asked. Because you said that the Republican advantage in Texas goes from about a 5% bias previously to about a 10% bias.
Yes.
If Prop 50 passes, how will that change the partisan bias in California?
That's a good question. I didn't look that up. I will look. It's currently the map is roughly fair. The Dems get a little bit of an extra boost at 50%, about 3%, which should come as no surprise. The map was drawn by this independent redistricting commission, which is not supposed to take politics aside. The answer is it's hard to draw a map that isn't that, given the political geography of California, that isn't particularly positive towards this. And I'm trying to think what the plan, if enacted, goes to a plan that would be I actually don't. My source of this is Plan Score, and they've done other analysis, but they didn't actually calculate the partisan bias. My bet is it goes to about from sort of my hard to do these off the top, but it probably goes to a map that's probably about Dem plus 4%, 5%, so a little bit. So doubling from 3 to 6 as opposed to tripling from 5 to 15 for the Republican map in Texas.
Yeah, I think that, the Democrats are expected to, all things considered, under this new map in California, pick up a couple of seats, right?
Yeah, as many as 5. Although we should be careful, right? The maps, those 5 new districts are lean Democratic, but they're not overwhelmingly Democratic. But that's been the issue, sort of in California. Democrats are polling well over 60%, so they're going to do very well in any map. You gotta, so it's just much. So I don't think so. I think in terms of bias, it's not as great. In fact, you have to draw things to sort of keep Republicans together to make them win seats in California, right? I saw someone point to an article, interview with former Governor Schwarzenegger. And he complains that in Massachusetts, there are no Republicans elected, even though, sort of 38 or 40% of the state votes Republican. It's the same problem. Once you these majority, these first past the post majority systems, once you get sort of much above 60% of the vote, it's really hard for the other side to win many seats. That's just the nature. If you wanted I guess the argument, if you wanted a more fair system that didn't have gerrymandering at all, you'd have something like proportional representation, although that has its own critiques.
So other states have been getting involved in this too. I think Missouri was one. Illinois has been talking about doing something. Virginia apparently is doing some kind of slight redistricting. Does this on a more normative side, does this concern you that we're seeing so much of this mid-cycle, mid-decadal kind of partisan gerrymandering going on right now?
Yeah, I think it's from a sort of democracy point of view, very disconcerting. One, that I am a believer that you would like plans to be fair. You don't want, go back to this question. We don't want politicians choosing their voters. We want voters choosing their politicians. Unfortunately, I think it's just another indication of sort of the highly polarized and partisan world we live in, that we're sort of both sides are willing to sort of go to any ends to sort of get what they want. Yeah, and so by the way, the states, now the reason Texas and California get the most is they're really big states, and the answer is you can really move the needle. The other states that have actually redrawn, Missouri's redrawn, and North Carolina has redrawn.
Okay.
North Carolina's an interesting case because they redrew even though there's a Republican governor, but he has Democratic governor, but he has no power to veto, and the Republicans have a super majority, have majorities in both chambers, and so voted a map that eliminates a couple of Democratic seats. But yeah, the big players are Texas and California. Missouri is, you're talking about one seat. The other ones that have talked about it are, as you mentioned, Virginia and New York, and Illinois. The problem in both, for different reasons, but New York and Virginia have sort of constitutional and statutory language in place, which requires some, like in California, where you have to overcome it. So that's why we have to go to the polls. We have to amend the Constitution. In Virginia, they have a rule that you have to have a bill has to be voted on in 2 sessions, and so there was an open session that was never closed, and so the question is whether or not that counts for this. Similarly, in New York, there's statutory language which created it. Not as strong as California, but an independent redistricting commission, and so this question is what legally the Dems can do in Virginia and in New York to sort of maybe move a few more seats.
So what do you think this bodes for the future of the redistricting process in the US? Are we gonna return back to that equilibrium where, generally speaking, states just redrew their lines after each census, or are we just going to be in this period of continual change with respect to especially congressional districts?
Unfortunately, I think it's the latter. I think you sort of let the genie out of the bottle, right? What you need is some sort of detente, some sort of a peace treaty between the Dems and the Republicans agreeing not to do this. I don't think they're going to do that. And particularly since the courts have said that, again, this all really came about because the Supreme Court recently ruled that partisan gerrymandering is okay. It's not judiciable. So I think given those together, you're not going to see any unilateral backing down. You're going to see more use of gerrymandering and to be honest with you, other types of changes to electoral rules that people think are going to benefit their side of the aisle.
Right. Now, for political scientists and analysts like you and I, this just introduces a huge amount of uncertainty into what we know about American politics, because 6 months ago, when people were asking me what would happen in the midterm elections, I'd say, well, I think the issue is it's all about the fundamentals, right? President's popularity in the economy, and those things right now would point to the president losing a considerable number of seats in Congress. The question wouldn't be whether he'd lose seats, his party would lose seats. It'd be really how many, right?
Right, and recall that the margin's really thin, right? The Republicans have about a 6-seat majority, maybe a little less with vacancies. So, yeah, I'm with you, right? Reading the tea leaves, given the economy, given Trump's popularity, we were mentioning while we were leading up to this, depending on which poll aggregating site you look at, Trump's approval is either President Trump's approval is either somewhere between -17 and -9. That's a really unpopular president for this early in their term. And in general, with rare exception, presidents do pretty poorly already at midterms, right? There's always this sort of what political scientists refer to as sort of thermostatic response, right? Voters bought the Republicans, and now they say, oh, maybe we went too far. We need to go back a little bit towards the center and move a little bit of power back to the Dems. And that goes to this question we talked about with some of the seats. Texas was already a pretty aggressive Republican gerrymander. So the question is, if they thought they could have done this big a gerrymander, why didn't they do it in 2022? And a lot will base on what you believe the sort of swing is going to be to the Dems. In particular, in Texas, what part of the success of Texas for Republicans has been gaining support among Latino Hispanic voters. But the latest polls show that given issues about immigration and immigration raids and the shutdown in the economy, actually Trump's approval and Republicans' approval has declined most among those voters. So the question is sometimes pundits like to refer to some gerrymanders that go too extreme as dumbmanders, right? They push it too far, and so that I think is an open question. If there really is a 7-point swing to the Democrats from the last election, it's how many of these seats that they're drawing are going to actually end up returning a Democrat, not a Republican. But that's what's interesting from my perspective.
Exactly, and that's from a political science perspective. That's one of the things that's truly fascinating here. But to just sort of game this out in aggregate, kind of in terms of congressional seats, if Prop 50 passes, do you think that and everything else is relatively constant, knowing what we think would happen in a midterm election with this kind of context? Do you think that Prop 50 is basically going to mitigate the Texas redistricting?
It will. So
the same equilibrium we'd be at anyway?
Yeah. So my bet is that Prop 50, if it passes, sort of neutralizes or does a little better than the Texas gerrymander. And then in these other states that we're talking about, the Republicans can only pick up sort of 1 or 2 seats, and the Dems may pick up 1 or 2 seats in some of these other mid-decade. So my bet is we're actually going to be pretty close to par. that we're actually not going to have changed the map very much, and it's still going to depend crucially on how the 2 parties are going to do in the midterm election, which is good for democracy. But this sort of process, portion of it seems pretty problematic.
Right. So one good question that we got in the Q&A from one of our friends here at Caltech, they're asking, perhaps too far into the future, but what are the odds that the California governor in 2030 proposes a ballot proposal that extends the use of Prop 50?
Oh, forecasting that far out in politics, that's almost an eternity. My bet is in all likelihood, yes. Because if the Republicans continue to hold sway in places like Texas, seems little reason to believe that that's not going to be true in the near term. And I would call 2030 relatively the near term. They're probably going to draw a map that's going to best for them. And I think nationwide, Democrats are going to be like, well, why shouldn't we do the same thing in our states with biggest support? For those who want to reform the redistricting process, this is kind of disheartening, but I think it's a perfectly reasonable conjecture that the independent redistricting commission might be gone, at least for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, that's I think that's my take on it as well. That once we've given them back this power, it's going to be hard for it to be reclaimed. But we'll just have to wait and see. Now, earlier you said that you thought that Prop 50 is going to pass. In fact, you go all down on it. But what if it doesn't? What if it doesn't pass? What if it goes down next week? What do you think that portends for, in particular, Governor Newsom?
I think it'll be a huge political defeat for Governor Newsom. He's definitely staked his cart to this Prop 50 horse, and he definitely has. I think the open secret is that he's running wants to run for president in 3 years. Well, start running for president well before that, but for the to lose that badly on something he staked his political reputation on, I think would be disastrous for him.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I think so too. He's put a lot of risk. Yeah.
That said, I think while he's somewhat popular in California, I'm not quite sure, sort of not really my area of expertise, but I'm not sure how his popularity carries over to the rest of the US.
Well, I think you can game out a scenario under which, he could be seen, if this is successful and the Democrats gain a lot of seats in this cycle, that the momentum of that for him could be that, he could be seen by at least a big chunk of the Democratic Party as a viable candidate in 2028, kind of the savior of the Democrats nationally, right?
Yeah, he's definitely done everything he can to make his national sort of reputation known, right? He's been taunting Trump on social media, which many Democrats are very happy about. This political punch is Prop 50 or something. So yeah, I would say he's doing the best he can do with his hand. We'll see what it pretends in 3 years.
So I got one last question that's a little different for you, and that is because in the news the last couple of days we've been hearing a lot of basically threats that the federal DOJ is going to be sending election monitors here to California, and that this morning even it sounds like the state's going to have monitors to monitor the federal election monitors. So we're going to have you're going to have vote centers like in Southern California where there are going to be more monitors than voters, I think. Do you think these monitors are necessary in California to ensure the integrity of this election?
I honestly don't. I don't think anyone's present any credible evidence that elections in California, or by the way, anywhere in the United States, are not free, fair, and generally incredibly well run on a relative shoestring, as you and I know from our work on the Voting Technology Project. This is more theater and this is more intimidation. In California, it's pretty interesting because just not that many voters vote in person on election day, right? I haven't voted in person on election day in, I don't know, a decade. So yeah, I think this is much more theater, although generally not a good sign for democracy, right? This is clearly done with the intention of intimidating Democratic voters in Democratic-leaning states. And that's just not a good use and not an appropriate use of federal resources, which are supposed to ensure the common good, as it were.
Yeah, I think some have even suggested this is sort of a harbinger of things to come. Sort of one page of the playbook that we might expect to see when we get into the 2026 midterms. So are you concerned that the election monitors might be doing more than just monitoring, that they might be, as you said, attempting to intimidate or otherwise disenfranchise voters?
That's the worst case scenario, and one which is hard to rule out given the other actions the administration has taken on using things like the DOJ for what look like outwardly political gain and decision making.
Yeah. Well, we're running out of time, and I do have two more things to ask you. First off, right now, what's the most exciting thing that you're working on in terms of your own research?
I'm still deeply interested in elections, and it's funny, I've been studying elections for more than 3 decades now, as you pointed out at the beginning, which is a truly horrifying thought. But I'm still working with Gary King and a former Caltech grad student, Danny Ebanks, who's now a researcher at Harvard, on how to model it. It's funny is that these models have been around. Gary King and Andrew Gelman, both of whom have been co-authors of mine, developed these models in the 1990s, and it turns out, like a lot of things, technology and computing have made possible models that they couldn't even dreamed of. In particular, so that's where the bulk of my time has been going on, and it's important, and it relates to these questions about partisan bias. How we estimate things like partisan bias is by having good models that forecast elections, and we don't actually have that currently.
Yeah, I've seen bits and pieces of this research project from Danny, because Danny Ebanks also does work with me, and it's very, very exciting research. I think it's going to really revolutionize what we know about elections and the ways in which we model elections. So looking forward to seeing that published soon, Jonathan.
Yeah, me too.
So thank you for being here today. Really appreciate, your time with us today, and, we'll see what happens next week.
I agree. It'll be fun to watch.